I'm really, really pleased to have Vincent Dowd, who's a BBC arts correspondent and World Service Radio. He's worked as a political commentator and in current affairs. He first met Dan when Dan did the amazing portrait of Harry Patch, which was at the National Portrait Gallery. And is that in the collection?
It's in the Victoria Art Gallery in Bath.
Okay, right. But I met Vincent when we were down in Cardiff. We went down in relationship to the portrait that Dan has been commissioned by the Welsh Rugby Union to paint. We went down there and we had a little exhibition of some of Dan's work. We also have a list of that work available for you. And Vincent was enthusiastic about Dan's work, and so we kind of got this idea that we would have this first talk here, a conversation with Dan that's being recorded. Vincent is going to start to grill Dan Llywelyn Hall.
Okay, I'm not going to give Dan's biography because I think most of you know it, so I'm going to run through it for those of you who don't in 30 seconds. Dan was born in 1980 in Cardiff. He went to the University of Westminster here in London. Among his best-known works currently, as we know, as we've just heard, is Harry Patch, The Last Tommy. And you'll find his work, both landscapes and portraits, in the National Gallery of Wales, the Museum of Modern Art Wales, and in the Royal Collection. And in December, as some of you will know, Dan went to Windsor Castle, where Her Majesty the Queen sat for him for a portrait commissioned by the Welsh Rugby Union, and we look forward to seeing that unveiled fairly soon. I'm going to talk and ask questions for maybe 10 minutes or so, and then throw the floor open to you. So those of you who want to ask a question, please do get that prepared. But I'm not going to start with any of that, really. I'm going to start somewhere totally different. Dan, I've always thought that deep down you probably love landscape work more than portrait work, although in recent couple of years you've probably been better known as a portrait artist. Well, first of all, am I right?
I don't really differentiate between them as subject matters. I think that I'm very often working simultaneously with both portraits and landscapes. So I don't really differentiate between them as a subject matter. The only difference is really the practicality, how you go about doing them. One requires being in the presence of somebody and it needs that connection. And the other is a much more, doesn't necessarily have to be located anywhere, but frequently I sort of travel and use that as a starting block.
And when you travel, at least when you're going somewhere new, do you travel physically with a sketchbook?
Yes, I don't. That sort of work I would always finish sort of on location. So I'd never really make a piece about a place had I not been there. Rarely, I mean I have done it, but very rare. And I sort of really truly believe in that, the necessity of going to a place and feeling the place, and having a sort of dialogue with it, I suppose, in some ways.
Having a dialogue with the location.
Yeah, which includes the people who live there. Its historical sort of footings. Its whole place in history, and also where it's going. I think I'm very interested in how these places hold the heritage, and how the heritage is passed on as a frequent sort of occurrence. I think in my.
So if you just turned up somewhere literally with a day ticket in your pocket, knowing you've got to get on a train in 4 hours' time, that wouldn't work for you. You'd need to begin to feel the place more. Yeah,
I would only really go to somewhere if there's a draw to it. There must be some. I think there's always has to be some connection. Usually, maybe artists. I'd like looking at whether artists have worked, not necessarily artists, writers, and anyone really. I think who sort of has given me some sort of inspiration or something, a hook whereby I'm keen to find out what really was going on around them at the time and what environment they were working in. So that's usually the beginning of it, I suppose.
You don't do cityscapes very much. They tend to be rural, mainly.
I like the fringes of places, so I find the inner city environment sometimes slightly overwhelming, and there's too much stimuli, really. I like places which have, which is somewhere on the fringes where you can get that slight sanctuary, but a sense of being in a place.
You mean the border territory between city and rural?
I think so, yeah, if you'd be specific about it in that way. I think it has to be really about that relationship. It's really about creating space for yourself, I think, when you're working in those environments. And you don't want too many things going on around you, I think. I think you have to fine-tune and select things when you're working from a place. So in those fringe environments, you don't get so much clutter, should we say, I suppose.
Can you remember the place where you first thought, yes, I got the spirit of that. That really worked.
There was one place which I remember very vividly, was the first place where I began sort of, I suppose, looking at a sense of place, and that was when I was in this woods during my foundation course in Cardiff, and there was a park we would take to the draw, and I just surrounded myself with these trees, and I began just doing these large triptych, I suppose, of these pastels. But I do remember vividly, I'd started to look at things, and I hadn't done it like that before. It was a very much a new thing for me. And I think that was probably the beginning. That's the earliest stage, I think. But I would have been, I suppose, 19 or something. So it wasn't exactly that. It wasn't sort of in my infancy.
Well,
although I've regressed slightly, I think.
Was there a point where you thought, okay, I'm going to try to make my career as an artist?
No, I don't think it's a career. I hate the word career when it comes to being an artist. I think it's part of your lifestyle. It's part of everything you do in the day. Everything feeds into it. So you can't separate a career from. If we
trade the word career for living.
Well, living's getting by. It's sort of making sure that you can sort of pay your rent and pay for your breakfast. But I think that element of it is slightly irrelevant, and I think that it's proven to be irrelevant throughout the whole history of art. Anyone really who's done anything of greatness, I think, have gone through periods they don't. I don't think that entered their heads, to be honest with you. Great people who achieve things have not necessarily thought that money is the driving motive for what they're doing. And I think if they were to do that, they'd do something else. I don't think it enters into the motivations why an artist makes work, I think.
Sticking to the biography briefly, was there any interest in your family in visual art before you?
My grandfather, who I didn't met, he died the year I was born. He was the only person really who had any sort of anything to do with painting. I've got some of his work, but I think that was sort of left an impression on me that there was this person in my background who had painted, and I did sort of appreciate his work, and I still do appreciate his work. So look at elements of it, I think that it was something he got right. But he wouldn't be able to share it with anybody. He was living in an environment. He was a train driver and an engineer, and it would have been an environment where he wasn't really having conversations about art. So it was very much a private affair for him. But I think that's the best. I think it's the best premise to make art. I think.
Was there a first artist, or maybe a couple of artists, who I'm assuming it might have been in your late teenage years, who really excited you?
I remember Rembrandt actually was one of in terms of portraits. I remember looking at his work and thinking that. It always left a lasting impression on me, and it made me really look at how the surfaces are created with it when an artist makes a painting, the complexities of it, the layers of it, and how it takes time to distill those, translate into feelings, I guess. Rembrandt, I suppose, are the recurring sort of figure, maybe someone like Matisse. Obviously, Van Gogh. Some of these people we're familiar with very early on. But some of those people stay with you, some of them you just forget about. But I suppose out of everyone, those three.
I'm going to alight on one artist, because I know we both enjoyed going to a show of his work earlier this year, which is Haim Soutine. I'm guessing that's maybe a slightly newer enthusiasm. What grabs you about Soutine?
I would say that it's the rawness and the fresh sense of emotion that's in his work, and he doesn't. It's very much worn on the sleeve, that sort of thing. I like the immediacy about it, and I like the fact that he's not really scared of how he feels about the subject. He makes it very direct when he translates it into painting. It's just very emotive, and it's fully loaded, I think, is the way I describe it. I think it's and at the same time it requires a bit of thought, and it's something you can't just brush away after the first appearance of looking at it. There are some artists' work has a very strong immediate impact, and it lasts for a very short amount of time, and it grabs a lot of people. So perhaps they have a large audience initially, but then there are people like Soutine, I think, whose work takes time to sort of digest, and you always go back to it with a different sort of approach.
Hopefully, choosing one or two of the paintings in the room, just take your own direction to tell us how you work, maybe with reference to one or two of the paintings. Tell us how you do your work.
Well, I suppose my latest approach would be to sort of go to a place. For example, these pictures I do in Gran Canaria, these ones in these small studies, were made directly on location. And as I was saying earlier, I think that when you do work like that, it has to begin and end there, I think, because you're already in a different set of emotions when you return, and you can't ever return to those state of mind. I think.
So you
really.
have to come back with it literally finished.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I very rarely pick them back up and work. I mean, studio pieces which are more layered, the more layered paintings. I think that there's no way I'd ever attempt to do something like that on location, because the practicalities of how you make those paintings requires time, and you don't sort of. So there are the slightly more ethereal sort of feelings ones, where they're more to do with general concept and sense of place. For example, the Bridestones painting, that was really, to give an example, is a picture a place I haven't visited. I hadn't actually been to make the painting there, but I was more entranced by the story. This idea that there was a newly wedded couple which died somewhere on this location, and these Neolithic stones were sort of built in the area, and this testament to these two people, which we know nothing about, but that the stones themselves have embodied this sort of idea, and it's transferred itself through the ages, I think.
In your bigger paintings, is there sometimes a narrative buried? Because in that case, presumably people wouldn't know that story.
No, I don't think it's necessarily relevant, really. I think that's sort of just an anecdote attached to the piece. Just much like when you go to the place and you see the stones, you wouldn't think that these people, you wouldn't know anything about the story itself. So I think they're just really the starting block and inspiration for it. I wouldn't really put it much beyond that.
And how much do you work? I mean, are there whole weeks when you never pick up a brush or a pen or a pencil?
Yes, there are, I think, because once you've gone through a very sort of quite exhaustive period of making work, you are completely immersed in it. You don't really live properly. You know, everything starts falling away at the sides, and you don't, particularly domestic issues like.
But isn't that the point?
Ironing and cleaning. And
isn't that the point of being an artist, that everything falls away at the sides, or a writer, or a composer?
Well, yeah, but then you've got to regather yourself at some point. You end up in a complete wreck, and I mean, I'm not. It also has, you know, repercussions in health. Well, I think you don't really pay much attention to anything else apart from, I think, at the time when you're making the work, because you are really. I think you have to be entirely involved in it. So. But
aren't those the points that every artist, every writer, everybody who creates actually loves above all?
No, I think some manage it very well, and everyone has different sort of working practices in the way in which you sort of combine your work with your life, and I think some people are very good at working them in simultaneously. It really depends. I think it's more personality driven actually, and I think that it's very individualistic the way. There is no one sort of common way of living, I think, which artists share.
Do you throw a lot of stuff away? I mean, is this the result, what we're looking at, of an awful lot of canvases which ended up scissored and put in the bin?
I tend to stick with a piece if I feel it's not really working. I leave it for a while. I might revisit it, and I've got a lot of work which I've yet to go back and do that with. It's hard sometimes to find get the momentum back to revisit those areas. So that's an ongoing concept. I'm not quite sure about that answer yet, but I would say that I do destroy work, but not often. I sort of maybe because I like that sense of the history. I like the ghosts that you can create when you've got that as an idea in the work. You can see it and you can use that to an advantage.
Is there a battle between you and the canvas?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, in those situations, yeah, because you've got to really forcefully make yourself go back to it. It's like picking up a half-finished book and sort of thinking, right, well, I know it's there and I'd like to finish it, and you've got it in your bookshelf, and you always think you'll come back to it, and then when you do, it begins as being a bit of a chore, but I think when you then pick it back up, you're very pleased that you sort of you've reconnected to it. But
if you feel you're losing the battle, is there either, I don't know, something you can look at online, or a favourite art book you would go to inspire you, or is there no such energy to be drawn from other people's work? Is it something you have to conquer yourself?
No, I think that's the occasion when you then go and see other artists' work, or you'd go through a period of reading or something else which can get you back on track. But that's why that's my way of dealing with those situations, is by probably looking at the other artists, because they can give you solutions, I think, to the problem you've got in your head. I think when you're going through a period of making a lot of work, you don't want to be looking at a lot of artists, because I think that can overwhelm you, and it starts seeping too obviously into your work, and you've got to keep that at bay. I think that sense of the influences, they can overwhelm.
Do you enjoy working in oils above all?
No, I don't. But I don't really think for me the materials are mainly down to practicalities. If I'm travelling and making work, I'm usually using water-based works. So oils are more studio-based, and it's really a question of what fits the bill at the time, I think.
Do you think there's a Dan Llywelyn Hall palette in terms of colours?
No, but I'm trying to change it at the moment.
Okay, what are you trying to
simplify it? Well, I mean, I think every artist is always trying to simplify the work and sort of get to the real essence of what they're trying to say, and that applies to me in terms of probably. I'm not saying that I dislike something I've done necessarily in the past with the way I've worked in colour, but I think that I'm always attempting, to maintain simplicity, the essence of what I'm doing.
Are there what people would probably now call signature colours?
I wouldn't think so, no.
How important is Welshness to you as an artist?
It's useful on occasions, yeah.
That's got a horrible spectre of career about it, if you say useful.
Well, I think that I think when people use their birthplace as a sort of selling point, it's as I've done, but I don't really think it's because it obviously that can taint you, and that can put you into that sort of that bracket, and in some ways it can be a sort of the cultural backwater that you end up paddling in, and I think you've got to sort of be very careful not to align yourself too much with a place.
So this is exactly the wrong point to mention that next year you're doing a Dylan Thomas project.
Yeah, but I mean,
tell us about that.
Well, Dylan Thomas, yeah, but he's an international name, and he's not. I mean, he made his way across the border. I think there are a lot of artists in Wales who have not made it past the border because they harp about the sort of nationalistic sort of I am Welsh mentality. But I think that he's one who didn't. He wasn't a Welsh speaker. And he managed to go beyond the border, and I'm interested. Yeah, the project I'm doing is
which is for his centenary year.
That's right. Yeah, and it's going to be a collaborative exercise with a friend who knew Dylan Thomas and has read bed stories by him, which was quite interesting. And his father, Ormond Thomas, was a good friend of his.
He's writing poems, or
the particular influence for this project is short stories. So I'll be looking particularly at Thomas's short stories and using them as a sort of a beginning to a series of etchings we're going to do with this Sandra's Gallery over a period of next year.
Okay, and when's that going to emerge?
I should think probably a year from now, so
okay.
maybe
this
May.
Strikes me as a good point to ask anybody who wants to ask a question to ask it.
When you were doing a recent series of portraits of writers called Portraits of the Pen, you spoke very powerful to me about you felt it was a chance for you to, I suppose, reappropriate the portrait of the painter as opposed to the sitter. And this seemed to be something that was, I suppose, centre to that project. I was just wondering if you could expand a bit upon that relationship between the sitter and the painter, and perhaps around the idea, because you did seem to feel that it was your chance to, it was your painting, not their painting.
I'll talk about it sort of the way I see it. I believe that I think paintings in portraiture should be something which are entirely of the artist's sort of perception of a particular dialogue. So for me, it was very important in this instance to go and speak with the writers and visit them, normally at their homes, and get a sense of who they were. And for me, you're making a painting distilled over a period of time. So in that time, nobody knows how they act around other people over a period of time, and we can only guess it, really. I mean, you can look at videos, you can listen to recordings, but how some people actually perceive you, one sort of never knows. So my idea with the Portrait of Pen was to make this series of portraits of writers, which is something that continues through all my portraits, I suppose. The theme is that I'd like to approach the sitter in a way where they are somewhat removed as the main thrust of the main emphasis of the painting, and it becomes more about the dialogue. So obviously the sitter, I mean, this is not a new thing. Sitters have historically disliked interpretations made by artists, and I sort of felt that I wanted to try and take this one step further, so I asked them to sort of make a response, written reaction to their own image. So once I'd finished the sitting, I then sent them the image, and they made a comment, and a lot of them were very dismissive. And it sort of opened up, it made me realise actually that how offended we can become really by being faced with someone's perception, which can only be translated through a painting. That's utterly unique. I mean, there's nothing else that can create an image made over a period of time, distilled into one image. For me, that makes portrait painting unique and all-powerful. So I think that really is, it is about that sort of idea of making that dialogue permanent, I think.
But also, I was interested in how quickly you worked in some of those instances, in that you seem to be working from sketches that were all that were almost made before the sisters even knew that they'd been made.
Yeah. Well, I feel that it's not really. I mean, as long as you're in someone's company for a period of time, you get a measure of them. It might not be as an accurate as measure as someone who's known someone for over 20 or 30 years or a lifetime, but it is a moment in time where a dialogue has taken place, and for me, that's the most important part of it. It's not the actual physical act of being there, making the drawing of them. It's more really about the experience of them and how their impression sort of sits on you, and how that can then, how you then interpret that, I think, is the thing. But it's so the physical way, the process you go through to make the piece in the first place is just, for me, the main emphasis is really about being with them and getting some emotional handle on it, I think.
Someone else must want to ask a question. Yes.
To explore the colour palette notion, because in some senses, well, the question really, to what extent influenced by artists who've gone before you, and I can see certain echoes here in terms of colour palette, or by the location. And if the location, do you ever use photography to capture any of that for later reference?
The instances where I use photography is if I need it as a point of reference, if I don't feel as though I've had quite enough time with it, or maybe I don't plan to revisit the place perhaps, but I would say that it's not essential actually. I feel that if you start, my big problem really is the fight with photography and try and keep, asking myself all the time, where is the relevance in painting? And I suppose photography can aid you in many ways. So I use it really as an aid, very sort of, it's barely scratched the surface in terms of what a photographer might do and how they might take a shot of something. But I would probably use it as a very basic reference, but nothing more than that. And it certainly wouldn't really influence my palette. I wouldn't be looking for, exact colours in particular ways, because it's always about that ground between your emotional reaction and the actuality of a place and the sense of place. So those things, that area in between is very, very blurry, and you can't pin it down, I think.
Yes, Dan. Just to get away from portraits and persons for a moment, do you have a landscape theme in mind, or something in your heart, a place you haven't been to that you'd like to portray?
I don't really feel as though there is a place, because I think that you really have to go somewhere to know really what you want to do with it. My only draws to different places really are to do with the people and the inspirations behind their work, is my initial attraction. So I wouldn't say I have a particular place I'd like to visit. I'd be going by basically what I've seen in papers and so forth, and I don't really trust them as a sort of the imagery that comes from them. The main inspiration for any visit I'd make to a place is the people and its history, I suppose, and its dialogue with its history is what drives me to go there.
Painting that really catches my eye, which is totally different from all the other work, because that one down there with the hand. Now, it's a very different colour palette, and it's a very different sort of painting for you now. Do you consider that a portrait? What are you trying to say with that?
Well, that piece is actually a study for the Queen's portrait. It's a pastels, my first venture into using pastels, in fact, actually. This particular piece, you're right to say it's different, because it actually is not a perceived finished final piece, in much like the other pieces you can see are. It's really an informative way I begin to make a portrait, and it's very rare, in fact, I'd start off like this. It's just on this occasion I didn't feel qualified enough to know the particulars about the hand gestures and things.
So you started with the Queen's hands. You thought that would give you an inspiration?
Yeah, so for me, as you'll see when the pictures unveil, that the hands really are probably the most, they're the things that direct you. I think they're like the baton sticks of the conductor. They sort of in some way lead you into really what the emotional stance I wanted from the portrait. That wasn't the gesture I used in the end, but it said something else. It was a different. That's for another portrait, I think. But yeah, you're right in the sense that particular piece, I suppose, doesn't appear to be anything like the others, because it's very much serving this need for fact finding and gathering information, feeling it out, I suppose.
Dan, did it matter to you that when you went to paint the Queen at Windsor Castle just before Christmas, I think, she's been Queen since 1952. She is perhaps the best known female face on the planet, in a way, certainly one of the best known. Does that make any difference to how you chose to portray her?
Well, I think you're portraying the collective image of her. It's obviously something that enters into your head, so you're sort of aware of how anybody is sort of universally perceived, I suppose, in the media. That's your first point of reference. So anybody who goes to see a portrait is going to be, first of all, thinking, do I know this person? Where is the point of reference? Where do I begin? Where does my dialogue with this person begin? That's the very first thing I suppose I have to tackle, is actually how do I approach this common knowledge of who this person is, and what do I say about it? So you have to, I think in some ways, when you're dealing with someone on that level, it's not essential, but I felt in this case, you can use that to great effect, because there's such a great common knowledge shared in this person. You can build that in as one of your counterpoints, I suppose. So yeah, it's something I was conscious of, and something I attempted to sort of skew in a way, I think, actually, into much more of a personal insight.
To take an obvious comparison, I'd seen, half a dozen photos over the years of Harry Patch, but I wouldn't really, if I'd rather improbably encountered him on the street, I wouldn't have known it was Harry Patch. But we all know the Queen so well. As you know, there have been something like 130 official portraits. But is that really just of academic interest?
I think that where you fall short on that sort of project is when you try to create this well-perceived image of who she is. And that's why I think a lot of it is absolute tat, because they're afraid to project themselves onto the picture. And really, what's the point in going along and sitting and doing another portrait, adding to the pile, if you're not going to bring in your sort of your interactions with this person? It didn't actually enter my head that I'd have to sort of create this image to match up and align with everybody else's sort of stance on it. I haven't got a clue what other people's stances are. I mean, I've got an idea, but again, that's projected to me by the media, which is not. It's very generic, and it doesn't really have any particular insights, and it's not one person speaking. It's someone speaking on behalf of a load of other people. So it's never really truly one person's viewpoint you're getting on it, I think.
Here's where I tempt and totally fail to get you into indiscretion. So did you talk much during the sitting?
Like when I've done many, other portraits for the writers, it was very important to have, create a relaxed atmosphere. So, I was in constant dialogue actually, and it was these things are ways in which you can assist with making, making it fluid and getting the reality and the sense of the person out of their skin, so to speak. So it's sort of it's an essential process to go through, because what you don't want is someone to clam up in front of you, sit there in silence, as people will do. They become more self-conscious and they don't sort of. So yeah, you're working with a much smaller time frame. You're conscious you only have this period of time, much like when I did the Harry Patch portrait. I knew I'd only had this very small bracket to work within. So there's part of you somewhat schizophrenic in some ways, because you've got to sort of separate the worker off the person who's there to get information, to gather the stuff which is going to work into the painting, and then there's the necessity to know the person and have a dialogue in some way, which is honest and not sort of just random chat which you expect some answer you're not really paying much attention to. So it's trying to juggle those two balls.
And was the Queen taking an interest in what you were doing, or has she sat for so many artists now she isn't really that bothered?
I'd be speculating there. I'd say a sort of.
Go on, speculate.
Well, no, I don't. I mean, there was no actual kind of a look at what you've done sort of thing. No, it was sort of. I think it's another day in the office. I think. Right?
So this probably won't mean much to people who haven't seen it, but you portray her as being, I don't know, a little bit tense. There's a kind of slight aura of angst around that. Am I misinterpreting, or is that something you were trying to get into the portrait?
I think she's a complex person.
Have you ever painted someone who wasn't a complex person?
Yeah, I have, yeah. And I think that they make themselves more obvious to you, and they don't have the guard, perhaps, that somebody like the Queen might have, in the sense that they're protecting themselves from the personality that they want to project, because that is their job. Her job is utterly unique in that sense. There's no one else in the world doing quite that sort of position. She can't really talk about it to other people. So I think it becomes it's a deeply, profoundly private thing, and preserving oneself against this public persona is a difficult balance to strike, probably.
Someone at the National Portrait Gallery told me that of the new portraits they see, she said roughly 50% were striving towards photorealism and 50% are, shall we say, school of Lucian Freud. Can you triangulate yourself between those 2 points, so to speak, or are those 2 points irrelevant to what Dan Llywelyn Hall does?
I don't. Well, as I've said, I don't really rely on the photograph. So for me, making it pictorially, absolutely anatomically accurate is a complete irrelevance.
There's clearly been a trend in the last 5 years. I mean, do you enjoy seeing those?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Why not?
Enjoy. But I just find them irrelevant. I think there are very good photographers out there who can make photographs look far, far better than trying to paint a picture that looks like a photograph. For me, it's sort of somehow completely self-defeating. There's some great photographers out there who can do work on a bigger scale with much more they can saturate things, they can change the colour, and without having to go through the labours of making a painting. I think painting's a very different thing. It's a very sacred ground which has to be treated a different way. You cannot see this. This is the problem, and this is always will be the greatest problem we have now with portraiture, is that this relationship between the photograph, what is real, what is the universally accepted image of somebody, and what a painting can be, and it's always going to be prevalent in every single portrait that probably comes out in the newspaper, everything that's given to the public and offered up.
So where do you see yourself fitting into the contemporary art world?
I'm not really conscious of it, and I think that the moment you do, you're in quite difficult and quite alienating territory, because you sort of begin to aspire to be something which perhaps you aren't in the first place. I think it's very dangerous there if you start sort of being conscious of the way you're working and making it look like something which is of the moment, or which is work which we could think of as being as contemporary. I mean, I personally, not being contemporary, I generally don't know what is the perceived appearance of contemporary art, and I sort of somehow find that description completely irrelevant, because I think art for me is always a timeless thing, and it's not of the moment. It's always something that permeates through time. So a Vermeer or a cave painting could be just as contemporary as a picture that's been made yesterday, because we're dealing with the same common themes and threads which run through our lives, which are constant. We've not suddenly changed species since the cavemen. We might be evolved a bit or developed slightly longer fingers, but I mean, essentially we are the same thing. So I think art really only in the way it's made can probably change, but I don't think the way you approach it ever differs.
Is your work changing? Are you aware of it being different compared to, 2 or 3 years ago?
Only in that it's become, the motives why I make work has changed, and that becomes it's more of a, it becomes more like therapy, I think, actually, for me. It's becoming more like that, in fact. It used to be different. It used to be driven by ambition and sort of wanting to be in a place by a certain point in time. And then you begin to, for me, it's changed because it's, you go through a certain phase of your life and you sort of feel as though it means something differently to you, and your whole motivations for why you make it alters. And that's been a slight shock in some ways to me, I think, because I always felt that when you have an ambition and a goal or something to be in a place, you sort of must keep true to that path, and really that's swayed a little bit.
Dan, as always, you've been extremely honest, which is your great characteristic. That's more than half an hour, which is what I said I was going to do. So, if anybody wants to add a last question, this is your chance.
When you were painting the Queen, was there an aura? If you had to quickly give me one word that described the Queen. Quickly. I can't think. Because I wondered if that's what you were left with, that you wanted to capture, is the point I'm trying to make. You suddenly have this connection, is what you're saying, in talking to her. And do you feel you were able to capture that? Are you pleased with the portrait? That's my question.
I think it'd be humanity, actually. I think that's what I was overwhelmed by, and what overrides, I think, throughout my whole process of having made the painting. I think was that being struck by the sense of humanity and I was very privileged to sort of have that sort of.
So how do you mean humanity?
Well, a sense of really of a dedication to you're always sort of conscious of someone who you see walking through parades of people and sort of making acknowledgements, never being quite sure entirely how that person is engaging with them and how genuine that transaction, should we say, is. In my impression, I felt that there was a sense of humanity which I was only firstly aware of it during my sitting. So.
Or a sense of empathy?
Yeah, empathy. Yeah, certainly empathy. A searcher, someone who's searching for the same sorts of answers we're all looking for. I think, someone with a sense of someone who's very philosophical, and you have to be to get through your day in that sort of, I suppose, in that sort of job. So yeah, it was just that sort of realising actually who's in front of you is a human being, and it's not just this brand or a sort of some fabrications in society, but actually someone who's relating to all the same issues we have, and trying to make it all work and tie it all together, I think. So let's say if I was to use one word, but I wouldn't like to use one word. I'd like to use a lot more words than that. I've been pinned down to one word.
Anybody else? Owen again.
How important is solitude for you?
it didn't used to be that important. I used to think I could sort of go on trips and make work from being in other people's company. But I've sort of since learned, and after having one trip, I went to Avignon for it was my first trip actually alone for a sustained period of time, and I felt it quite unnerving. I didn't really quite know what to do. I sort of thought I'd go along my canvas, and I'd sort of have these experiences looking around the place, and I was very frightened at one point. I thought, right, God, I've got a week of this. I didn't have any idea how I was going to sort of react and how I was going to deal with people. Was I going to get into conversations? And I sort of, it was a self-imposed almost exile in some ways. I sort of felt as though I really must break this boundary of myself and get into this territory. So after having sort of, made my way through that week, it was a real triumph at the end, because I felt as though I sort of unlocked this quite sort of shy sort of individual in my art-wise, someone who could sort of really relate to the world on their own. And the great sort of misconception I had was that I thought I could do all this with other people around me, but actually it's something, an action to do very much on your own and digest, and you become more aware of yourself, and you allow the real person, I think, to sort of emerge, and that can then obviously translate into the work, and you can get a much better handle on where you want to go with your work and what you're trying to say, and the real sort of questions come out, I think, actually, that they never had before in such a way, such a torrent.
Okay, unless anyone else has another question, that's 45 minutes. That's an entire edition of Newsnight. That's quite tough to talk about yourself for 45 minutes. Dan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all for coming.